and you have to make sure that your UV layout is reasonably laid out, and you use as much space as you can. Well, you can see that I was pretty lazy on this. So, for example, you have some, or I left some areas blank, which is not good if you want to optimize your UV space, because you want to squeeze out as much as you can to get more resolution out of your texture. But you can see over this left side I tried to move the pieces as close as I could, but it really depends whether you have time to do this or you just have like 2 minutes to make an UV layout for your object. Because if you want to make a game, you won't have time for each UV to spend like 2 weeks on it to make sure that everything is placed in the right corner. So it doesn't matter, I say, because you won't have time in the future. So anyway, if after you laid out your UV, you need to make sure that it is actually looking good in Max. What I do is always that I apply a checker map texture on it. Well, it doesn't see, well, you cannot see it from here, but if you would zoom in, you would see that almost all the checker box texture pieces on this object are laid out perfectly, or nearly perfectly, so there won't be any squeeze or any type of distortion on this texture, and that would mean that uh, nothing bad would happen on the lighting on this object. Yeah, and I also wrote to try to achieve a clean unwrap, because it looks in the end it would help you not to screw up your model with bad texture. Okay, so let's see step 6, which I think I will speak of the baking. Yeah, texture baking. So for texture baking I have 3 basic steps. First, not first step, but the one step, one of the steps are that baking the AO map, normal map, and then height map for parallax mapping. AO map is the ambient occlusion, which means that it transfers all the lighting information onto your object, which will make your object look much more realistic, instead of using just a plain texture map with no light on it. The normal map will make sure that you can transfer your high poly data onto your low poly object without using much triangles. And the height map is a good new feature, or not a new feature because it was used in ages ago, but first it appeared in Half-Life 2. So anyway, the height maps are good for to enchant the normal map by giving light reflection to it, because if you just use a normal map it doesn't reflect light as much as if you would use a height map, and it looks much more realistic. Just look at Half-Life 2 maps. You can see that they look gorgeous. So anyway, the first thing would we do is to make a normal map. So why starting with normal map? Because this is the easiest thing to do in Max. So first you have to have a high and low poly, and you have to make sure that they are on top of each other exactly, so they overlap each other. The second thing to do would be to, if you have a unwrapped low poly, I would attach, or I would I would attach a projection modifier onto it, and I would use the cage function for it to define whether the rays would cast the high poly, and I will show it later. And after that I would just simply hit the render to texture button, after I selected the normal map output, because I do not have to use lights and any other magic things at all. So what does it looks like in real life? So as you can see, I have my low poly, which has the checker box texture on it, and the high poly, which is uses only a gray material. Yeah, and the other thing that I have to make sure that I use one smoothing group for low poly. Yeah, and I just realized that I forgot to mention that normal maps usually, and not just usually, uh, in most of the time they do not like 90 degrees edges. As you can see, not I only use 90-degree edges, but that's not cool for it. So keep in mind that if you chamfer your edges, your baking would be look much more nicer. And because I did not put much effort to this model, I didn't use chamfered edges, so sorry for that. So anyway, by using one smoothing group, that will allow me to catch all the information on this high poly without having to run into problems with the ray not hitting the high poly correctly. So keep this in mind. This is very important thing. Um, yeah, as you can see, I just placed the projection modifier on top of the unwrapped low poly, and as you can see, I mentioned that I use the cage function and with the shaded version. This is the very most important thing, because if you use the shaded version of the cage, you can see the areas which are missing, which are below the high poly, and you have to bring that up to cover everything in the space, like in this top area. And you have to also make sure that if you increase the distance between your cage and your objects, it will cause some errors. You have to keep in mind that you have to keep this cage as tight as possible. And yeah, optimize for test baking. That's the first thing you should do. So let's continue with the test baking. So as you can see, the output on this right corner would be this if you hit just the render texture button. As you can see, it has some red areas which represents the area sorry, which represents the places where the ray did not hit the high poly object, so you have to modify the cage for that. And if you're ready with that, you can just uncheck ray mischeck, and you just hit the render button. I think I have to use the uniform super sampling for this if you want to achieve a very high resolution texture for your normal map, and that's a very crucial point. But the normal map would look something like this if you would open it after rendering it in Max. Okay, so after we have our correct normal map with as low errors as we could, we just you just only have to edit some minor things in Photoshop if you wanted to, because in some cases you cannot make a perfect normal map and you have to correct it by manually. So anyway, the next part would be the height map, because the height map uh, is a much complex thing to do, and you will have to use more advanced settings for Max. The first thing would do to unwrap the high poly. And how can I achieve that? Well, I had just to simply select the high poly and put an unwrap modifier on top of it and align it to, I don't know, X or Z coordinates to make it perfectly set up for the gradient material which I will place on it, and then I will just render the diffuse texture. And I will show you that after I unwrapped my high poly, it would look like something like this. As you can see that if I would apply a gradient material, that would be a black to white, which would mean that the lowest parts, as you can see on this picture, the lowest parts are highlighted with black, and the higher it gets wider, and it has a smooth transition from black to white. And you can check this in the max viewport or in the UV unwrap by enabling the gradient material. Yeah, and what settings do I need? Well, I mentioned in the other slide that I can use the adaptive uniform supersampler, and the other thing that you have to use a light tracer for this in the rendering window with a skylight, and that's a very crucial thing, because if you don't use these two with your rendering, then it won't work simply. Okay, and the last thing would be to render our AO map for texturing, and you can use the same settings, same render settings which you used for the height map, but only you have to put a gray or a simple material in your high poly, not a gradient, and you can just hit render to diffuse or render to texture button, and that's all. You don't have to do anything, so you just order one thing and you can bake it out in a second, and it would looks like something like this. Because you can see that on the edges you can see a pretty smooth transition where the light hit the surface, so it gets darker where the areas are much darker. As you can see in the inside parts, they are much darker gray than the flat surfaces which cast direct light. Okay, what are things which yeah, and the last thing, oops, would be to bring it into UDK after I've finished the texture in Photoshop or any other image editing software you have. I won't go into that in details because this is not that place for it. You can use your imagination or your experience on how to actually draw the texture on your pre-baked maps. So after I import in my materials, I have two images. I have to make a material in UDK, and it would look something like this. So first I have my material box. I just place simply all my textures into this space. As you can see, one is for the final texture, one is for the normal map. Don't bother with this because it's another object I have, and I just simply connect those black boxes to the diffuse. So connect all the channels to the diffuse and all the channels for the normal map. And now comes the magic or magic, because I have to use a bump offset object which I will connect to the UVs, and this is the place where the height map comes in. And I have to remind you that I have to place, or you have to place the height map into the alpha channel, because you cannot use any other channels because it won't work. So I just simply connect them that to the height channel, and voila, it's working. So this is the basic, most basic parallax mapping that you can imagine You can tweak this by multiplying some of these textures to make it pop out more. But if you have or if you want to have a basic layout, this is the perfect way to start it. So thank you for listening, and I hope that this small tutorial was useful for anyone who watched it. Thank you and goodbye.